Hey there, aspiring horror authors. It's another episode of Sako and the Moon, created by two self-published horror authors. Horror author Carl R. Moore is known for his intense atmospheric storytelling that blends psychological and supernatural elements. His work explores the darker side of human nature, drawing readers into unsettling and terrifying worlds. Let's get to know him. I am Sako Toomey, artist and author and a bunch of other things, but we'll just mention that I'm self-published 4 times over. I've been working on my craft for decades, and now I'd like to share my skills with you guys.
Yeah, absolutely, other guy.
Hey.
I'm Dewan L. I am the other guy. I am Dewan L. Hearn, more affectionately known as the Moon, once published, and I do other. I'm the doer of things. I write stuff, I film stuff, and I talk to people. And of course, one of the people that I talk to, besides just Sako, she's over here, is the guy in the middle. This is our friend from Imaginarium, the convention we're always talking about that takes place in July. He is the author of the book Red December. This is Carl R. Moore. What's up, Carl?
Hey, how's it going? Here's the book, Red December. So I'm the author of Red December, a horror novel. This one is actually published by Seventh Star Press, which is an indie press headquartered in Kentucky, and they host Imaginarium, the convention you were just mentioning. And so this book and a few other of my horror titles are published with them. And I'm really excited because this Red December was just released in July, and I'm just starting to do some more promotion as the title, as it says in the title, it takes place in December during hunting season. So in the North anyway. And so this is the right time to get in the mood and get it started.
I mean, it only makes sense that you start promoting Red December near December. I mean, that just, it works. It kind of makes sense. I have the benefit of when that title was coming out, I got a sneak peek of the cover because I was hanging out with the heads of that press, Stephen and Holly, Stephen Zimmer, and I got, he's like, hey, have you seen Carl's new book cover? I'm like, he's like, it's in the box. It's in the box. So I got to pull out the box. It's an absolutely beautiful cover, dude. Like, it's wow, like chef's kiss work.
Yeah, I thought they did a great job with it. I think it captures the mood. Bloody footprints in the snow. How can you go wrong? And also, the title. I was thinking, I wonder if it's going to get confused with like a Christmas story or something, which would be kind of funny, or maybe, depending on what kind of shape it leaves the person who thought they were about to read about Santa. But the bloody footprints in the snow kind of clue you in. I mean, like. Maybe I guess you could think maybe it's like Rudolph or something, but then like that would be some kind of like badass Rudolph that's leaving like blood in the snow, like maybe the sleigh crashed or something. No, but really, So it's a werewolf story that takes place in the woods. It really starts in November, and it kind of enters into December as the story moves along. And it's I would call it like a maybe like an alt werewolf story. It uses some of the lore that's classic for werewolves, but it's not so much it definitely takes liberties with the lycanthropes and the portrayal of the lycanthropes.
So for someone who's maybe tired of the same old werewolf story, this is definitely what they should be picking up.
Well, yeah, I mean, hopefully, if for folks who like that sort of thing, I like it when there's a lot of imagination in a story. I like it if you take a classic theme and you kind of that's a great way for the audience to start out understanding what's going on. There's some of the main classic creatures like vampires and werewolves and so forth. So in a way that can get somebody reading clued in quickly with maybe a little less exposition. But then But then when you kind of innovate and you take that classic creature and do something different with it, something a little bit unusual, then it can be more exciting and more interesting. And I'm okay with that. My suspension of disbelief will go pretty far if somebody's doing something wild and imaginative with their characters and their creatures in a horror story.
Makes sense to me.
I was gonna say, what can you tell us? Like, do you have a log line for Red December?
Well, I can read I'll read the back matter. I read the back matter. It's like dark matter, but it's back matter. Outside a small town in the northern woods, a group of hunters fight for their lives as a disease burns through the local population of humans and wildlife. The sickness causes horrific mutations and turns its victims into wolf-like monstrosities. But what do these creatures call themselves? And who within the town of Alton, New York, may see this nightmare as an opportunity? Can veteran hunter Cade Kershaw lead his ragtag group of rogues and at-risk youth to contain the infected before the authorities destroy the place they call home? The deadline is December, and the answer lies beneath blood and snow.
Now, I love that because you're able to take the title, and without repeating Red December, you're able to shape it into the deadlines in December, and the answers out of the blood. You're able to say Red December without saying Red December. You avoided the repetitiveness, and I love that.
Well, that's kind of you to say. I really just I'm kind of decadent and shameless in that I just love horror stories that take place in the cold, that everybody's like freezing and starving, and then worse things happen. I just find that just thrilling and so, sort of ridiculous and over the top, and yet really, really fun. I can't. Some of my favorite, of like frozen horror stories are obviously The Thing is like a classic, Antarctica that it's set like horror story. There's the earliest, the 1950s movie, but of course the John Carpenter flick in the 80s is the one, and just the atmosphere that combines that kind of frozen wilderness with survival and the gruesome threat of whatever terrible thing's about to happen. Just for me is like is a thrill like no other.
My favorite chapter, one of my favorite chapters of World War Z, everyone says go north, go north, go north, go north. So people pick up and go north, and it's the dead of winter, and the zombies are slowing, and they're frozen. So they go through all these terrible things during the winter because what it takes to survive the winter when you don't have resources. And then the thaw happens and the zombies return. So I really loved that chapter.
Yeah, it's a flavor that just I feel like is like inherently filled with threat and lots of ways that contending with survival on multiple fronts. Another good frozen horror is Dead Snow.
Dead Snow is a good one.
Norway is great fun. I feel like H.P. Lovecraft, Mountains of Madness is sort of another one, another Antarctica story, and even Edgar Allan Poe, his Gordon Pym novel has only attempted a novel where they go to Antarctica. That ends up being a little bit psychedelic once you get to Antarctica, but the feel of that immensity of dealing with the cold, it also exists in that story. I think what's interesting, I hang out with my daughter, and she'll come downstairs like, oh, you're watching Ice People again, like some form of people who went to the Arctic and didn't bring enough enough food, and like, the whole like Royal Navy in the entirety of the 19th century looking for the Northwest Passage. The Terror is another one. The Terror is a great one. But all that stuff's inspiring, and I just find it cool the way, no matter, on the one hand, you can be over the top with these creatures. You can have werewolves in the snow and that sort of thing, but then the elements are also a constant threat, and just the simplicity of that, the idea that Earth itself is almost like an alien planet and harsh to the creatures. We're born of the Earth and we were meant to be here, and yet we can go to parts of the Earth where it's really hard for us to be here. And even like, I was watching a documentary about Apollo 13 the other day, and I found it hilarious that, well, maybe not hilarious, in a darkly, sort of sardonic way, but like that the astronauts were talking about, I think it was Buzz Aldrin or somebody was talking about how after they solved the brilliant solution to their technical problems, they got around the moon. On the way back, they realized they were really cold and didn't have enough food. So like as they were trying to come back, so I was like, wow, it's like from the Vikings to the Royal Navy to the astronauts, the cold is always a menace.
Yeah, I've never taken the time to think about the cold. Like, I'm not a fan of the cold. I'd rather be too hot than too cold. I struggle with the cold. And I've never really thought of using the cold itself as like an antagonist in a sense, or like an aid to the antagonist. That's really insightful. I might have to give more ice-themed horror more of a shot.
So I feel like, is that a personal fear? Or because obviously it's a real life experience, right?
Well, I mean, I grew up in Maine.
Yeah. Do you feature your own fears in your horror novels?
I think it's more like, for me, it's about identifying wildernesses. Like, what are places? To me, the wilderness is exotic, and I have like almost like, to me, the fear for me is the tedium of the suburban landscape. That's what I'm afraid of. So, George R.R. Martin, who's made much of the frozen setting, like, winter is coming and the White Walkers and so forth, north of the Wall. The idea of a fantasy setting like this, and this is a horror novel for sure. It has, it leans more on John Carpenter than it would on something like George R.R. Martin. But the point is that, growing up in rural Maine and being, my father had a little log cabin close to the Canadian border, and we were on the frozen lake in the winter all the time. And we would go out there, and I remember cutting through ice 3 feet thick to get a hole through the frozen cover of the lake so that we could fish, so that we could ice fish and put our line in, and just standing on that lake and feeling this primordial immensity of like the stars above me, if it was like early morning and we're getting our traps out for the day, or it was like that just this incredible sense of being very small in a sort of like cosmic horror or Lovecraftian way. And then, but that in itself wasn't what generated fear. It was also the sense of freedom in the wilderness, seeing animals along the silhouetted tree line. If you saw wolves, for example, they were probably coyotes at that point. Timber wolves are rare up there now, if they're there at all. But the point is, even though it was frightening, there was also something invigorating about it and something exotic about it. And so I don't look to literature ever for reassurance, and fear isn't something that I necessarily find frightening. In fact, fear is kind of a way of feeling alive and awake, and free. And so, like, I feel like if anything, the kind of landscape, and in Red December, the werewolves, for the readers, as if someone gives it a try, part of what the werewolves are kind of reacting against, they're the villains and they're doing some terrible things, but at the same time, living in the wilderness, there are motifs about the encroachment of the tedium of our day-to-day landscape, our day-to-day box store, franchise, suburbia, clone architecture world, kind of impinging on this wilderness. And so even though the wilderness is threatening, it's also something that can make you feel very alive.
Ooh, that's deep.
for a short time till you get eaten.
Oh yeah, that's fun. At that point, you don't care.
So how do you approach creating villains like that?
I almost always, and sometimes to my detriment, like the villain in the story better than any other character. Like, not because I sympathize with what they're trying to do, or a lot of people say like the villain makes the story, but I really love writing, the villain's point of view, even if but I wouldn't want to confuse it with sympathizing to the villain's ethics. It's more like a sense of tragedy, understanding, for something like, even like I'm not much for superhero stories, but when you get like Lex Luthor's story, or you get like, the Penguin now is an anti-hero, is one that's contemporary, that sort of thing. That I'm not much for superhero stuff, but the superhero genre does kind of demonstrate, when it gives like hero or rather villain origin stories, it usually tries, in at least in some way, to that the concept that understanding what makes a villain is what creates that pathos and almost sympathy, and then tragedy, so that we can sit here as the audience and experience what the villain is feeling without ourselves doing the terrible thing and having the terrible fate for ourselves. I feel like that sense of tragedy is something that is a little bit lost these days. We get it in a cartoonish way in some sense, but I feel like there's almost audiences for horror especially is trying to kind of fill that gap where we've lost tragedy, where the idea that literature doesn't have to be affirming. You don't need a hero to necessarily save the day. It can be the place where we experience these dangerous feelings and come out and then put the book down and live to tell about it.
The Joker movie, I haven't seen the second one yet, the one that just came out. That first Joker movie is a fantastic example of that, in my opinion. Because
I loved it.
You sympathized with him the entire time until he makes the switch, and you're like, ooh, well, we kind of get it. We kind of get it, though.
Yeah,
I agree with them, but we get it.
Exactly. I loved it up until the very end. It kind of lost me a little in that last scene on the talk show. It got a little bit, for me, a little corny there, but otherwise was really amazing and painful to watch him struggle, but generating the sympathy. But it was strange to, for me anyway, on the one hand, to sympathize with his issues he was struggling with, but also be happy when Batman's dad, I'm losing the name at the moment, but right, socks him in the bathroom, like, he had it coming. You're like, this guy's being a pain, and he kind of had that one coming, but at the same time, I felt bad for him. So it was interesting to kind of have to have the emotions going in both directions there.
Yeah.
What role does violence or gore play in your horror stories, and how do you balance it with psychological horror?
Well, that's a great question, Sako. And I'll go out on a limb here and say, it's almost like I feel like I'm playing the fool a little, because I feel like I want to say that if I had a nickel for every time somebody wanted to tell me, hey, have you ever thought about doing psychological horror? Sometimes psychological horror is more frightening than violence and gore. And I think that's true. But I would also say I don't think it's rare. It's not a surprise. It's not something that I feel like would be a revelation to me. In fact, I think it's more of a challenge to have violence and gore come across in a way that's interesting and intelligent. That's harder to do, because psychological horror would be more accepted, and it's not going to turn off people who are upset by the violence and gore, which is cool. That's legit. Like, I always say that, like, let's say you're a person who distills strong whiskey. You don't want a person who can't handle whiskey to drink your whiskey, and not everybody likes whiskey, and some people, it's not good, don't do well with it. So you want to respect that. So I feel that way about violence and gore. This is a strong tonic. I want to make a fine one. I want to age it. I want it to be beautiful. I want it to be an excellent, like an excellent whiskey. But at the same time, I totally respect when folks are, it's not their, that's not what they're into. But at the same time, I do like that challenge where I like to really mix depth of character, psychological depth, with the gore. I like the gore to have a purpose. I want people to be I want it to be gripping for the reader, and I want them to be interested in a way so that the violence and the gore, even if it's shocking, is moving the story forward and telling you something about the characters and not simply fetishized. Sometimes it's fun to fetishize it in a movie if you're just, doing the slasher thing. But I'd like to think of it, to go, instead of the whiskey analogy, to go with like music. I'd like to think of it as like, a heavy metal song that maybe has a neoclassical guitar solo. So it's loud, it's distorted, the singer's loud, but at the same time, if you break down that guitar solo, it's quoting Bach, or something. Like, it's got this excellent, it's not just a straight up harmonic minor. It's like this really a very sophisticated solo that you can just rock out to on one level. But if you decided to look underneath, you'd realize that it's a complex and interesting piece of music. So I see the violence that way. I would see the violence in the gore. The Thing is a good example in a movie where it's like that movie that the gore is over the top, right? The guy's head pops off and then legs sprout out and his head's running around on the floor with spider legs. I mean, it's totally over the top, but the way that reveals the nature of the monster, the unique nature of that monster being an organism where every cell is like a separate organism and can spontaneously mutate, that I think that's super cool and super interesting, and an original take on alien life forms. And so, to my mind, that is probably a great example of an intelligent use of over the top violence and gore.
As a Kentucky boy who loves rock music, I love both those analogies.
Yeah, man. You're in Kentucky now? That's where you're coming from? Oh, cool.
Born and raised in Kentucky, so yeah, whiskey analogies. Close to the
Yeah, I was given a bottle of Willits for my birthday by a friend yesterday, so I was so super stoked. I'm becoming fond of that state, going there every summer for the conference.
Yeah. There's a lot of good bourbon to explore here.
Do you feel that horror needs to have a moral or a lesson, or can it be purely about the experience of fear?
I mean, I think, I remember reading, I think it's Stephen King's On Writing or some other essay he wrote, where he was really kind of pushing back on what at the time, even back in the 1970s, were like overt political allegories, where he was like, I just want to write a good story. I just want to write The Shining. And of course, there are going to be political and sociological elements in, say, something like The Shining. Obviously they're about, the American family, masculinity, economics, and these things are in The Shining. But I think, to my mind, I would agree with his early analysis. And of course, it's different. So much has happened since then. But I like the idea that when something's too obvious and too overt, then it kind of it prevents it from being exciting and interesting, and it spoils the sense of discovery, because it's really obvious. It's really obvious that a person's trying to say something about, war, or, like international relations, or whatever political allegory they're trying to say something about. Something like in like canonical literature, something like Pilgrim's Progress, where the characters are named after like the morals that they're trying to, pious pilgrim, and all these kinds of names, where you're naming your character after the moral that they're representing, personifying like an abstract moral. I kind of go in an opposite direction of that. I don't like it when it's too obvious. And I do feel like I see a lot of stuff nowadays where we really want to, in the name of some form of justice, explain to somebody that, okay, we really want, this person who had this awful thing happen to come out on top, and we want to teach everybody to be better. And that kind of like, I felt like, what was that movie recently that was sort of semi-post-apocalyptic, and it didn't really rock my world? Civil
War?
Oh, well, Civil War is another good example. Actually, that good example, Dwan. That one's, it had its moments, but I feel like that was one where I felt like the moral allegory was a little bit too obvious for me. It's just I don't disagree with the moral thesis with it. That's an important distinction. I'm not saying that
the head with it is, yeah, it
It was
doesn't.
pretty obvious to me that the photojournalists were the good guys and that these awful people were the bad, terrible people who, you know, like they're going to do these terrible things. And oh my goodness, for me, that's you know, I wanted if I what I would have liked to seen in a movie like that was somebody write the villain's point of view, the guy who shot that poor dude from Hong Kong. Like, let's see how this guy became twisted. Let's see what's going on there. Like, to me, that's interesting. Like and you know, in maybe a somewhat subtler way. It's hard to do. It's hard to do quickly. That's like the skill of the craft of writing. You don't want it to go on and on. You only have you have an economy of time to develop the characters. So how do you do it?
Yeah. For the record, if you're talking about like political allegory and horror, we are going to, you know, Sako and I, we also do movie reviews, and we are going to do a review on a very politically kind of motivated movie, The Hunt, that came out in 2020. And you're going to join us for that review, aren't you?
Oh, you guys are awesome to invite me for that. What a great one. It's a cool movie and interesting stuff there. Yeah.
So we're going to hold off on any conversation about that movie because we're going to save that for the review. I'd love to hear your views, especially after that. I completely agree, because when I hear, like, when Sako, when you ask that question, my first thought is, does every horror have to have a moral line at the end, or can horror just exist as horror? And in a sense, and this is, I guess, well, I'll ask you, Carl. Do you think that it's scarier? Because normally we're all writers. Our characters typically go through an arc, you know, from beginning to end. Do you think that it's actually scarier if the main character goes through this terrible, horrible experience and doesn't learn anything, or nothing new happens, or nothing changes? Like they kind of went through it just to go through it? What are your thoughts on that?
I don't know, like, you know, so the first answer was that I don't like it when something is too overtly a political allegory. But on the other hand, I don't think it's possible for something to not be. I think every story, just by dint of what you choose to write about, even, is going to say something morally or politically about the context in which the author lives. I mean, like, you know, I went to school in the 90s and it was all about deconstruction and we had all that stuff. So, you know, the idea that the authors are all products of their culture. And so what goes through the author and onto a page or into a script is all of the elements of their experiences. And so they're always going to have some kind of bias based on their context, and even their insights are going to be based on their context. So having said that, like, the idea that we have a horror, you know, novel where it's like, okay, this character did grow or change and there's no like overt morality. But if you, like, you know, if you're watching Beavis and Butthead and Beavis is running around fantasizing about being a cop and, you know, running around shooting his gun, you know, like, you can say, oh, he's just a fool and he didn't learn anything. But at the same time, it can be frightening. Like, whoa, what does it say, you know, about American culture and these twerpy, you know, high school kids and what's going through their minds, you know? Like, so I don't think I would say that it's there's like the spectrum of how obvious you make your allegory or your metaphor. So maybe, Dwan, what I'm hearing is the idea, like, if the allegory is really buried deep or not even aimed for at all, then maybe the audience has to do a lot more work to figure out what is the meaning of this, what is the context.
Yeah, if I'm not presenting you the answer, how do you form an answer if there's a question at all?
I'd rather err on that side than on the, I'm going to club you over the head with this moral I'm trying to teach. I'd rather err on the side of, this is a senseless thing that we would have to, like, that comes across as senseless, but then is less senseless once we start seeing the context it came out of. Is more interesting and I think more powerful in the end.
It definitely leads to discussions like this that can be, I mean, obviously, if a movie's up front and in your face and knocks you over the head with what the meaning is, it's kind of, it doesn't leave room for debate or conversation about it. And I love any piece of media or art that opens the door to conversation and interpretation. Like, 'cause again, like you mentioned, different experiences, different contexts. You and I might watch the same movie, and based on your life experience or my life experience, we're going to interpret that possibly in a different light. And I love those kinds of conversations.
Yeah, it's fun, and it comes down to like just finding your audience and what people engage with and want to engage with. We did a reading together at Imaginarium, and I read the first chapter of Red December.
Yeah, you did.
And it was fun, and I was a little worried. I was like, because I was like, I wanted to make sure that it was like a mixed genre kind of crowd, and I just wanted folks to know that I'm not really much for trigger warnings, but at the same time, using the whiskey metaphor, I want to let people know there's going to be whiskey in the drinks, like before they take a sip, like it's only
it's
fair,
important to know whether it's 80 proof or 120 proof. It's good to know that up front.
Yeah, exactly. And like if it says whiskey bar on the door, then maybe I wouldn't do it. If it just said this is all horror, but because it wasn't all horror that day, that was a great reading that day too. It was such a fun reading, hearing everybody that day. But so I didn't go in deep. I didn't make a list of all the little itemized triggers. I just want people to know, oh, this is a horror story. So crazy stuff's going to happen. Bad things are going to happen to people, but yeah. So, but I think that that's exactly the kind of like I had somebody who read this and said, hey, of all your books, I think this one is the best written, and I really dug it, but man, it gets so gory. Like for a minute I was like, oh, I really like the characters and the writing. I wish we could have just done a character study, and then all hell breaks loose, and it's just like, blood and guts and everything. And I was like, okay, well, it's heavy metal, it's horror, it's what it's going to have a loud guitar solo. That's where we're at.
But I think that's good, because I think you don't want to lead your as a reader. I'll say that as a reader, I don't want to just like follow along with everybody and then just go along with them. I'm like, I want to experience this with them. And if they're in a horror story, that's not going to be a pretty thing to experience. So to get to the point where I like these guys, I'm cool with hanging out with them, and then all of a sudden that, then the horror happens, that's exactly how it's to work out. In my view.
Oh, for sure.
How do you develop characters that feel authentic within terrifying scenarios?
Well, you're dealing with stuff that's not real. And some folks just cannot, you got to find your audience who's willing to suspend their disbelief for that. My dad used to crack me up. I was telling him about the movie, I think it's called Trolls. It's a Scandinavian movie where the guy's like a troll hunter. Like, I think there's one that's troll hunter or one that's trolls, but it's like he's going around the landscape and hunting these trolls down, and they're these giant trolls. And I was like, oh, it's a fun movie, and it's a cool allegory, and everything about certain elements of the culture there. And then and he was like, well, if they could just, if the trolls could be proven scientifically. And I was like, it's not like, I was like, Dad, I was like, because he's just not interested in anything that's not real. Like, and so some folks, when you're making, to answer your question, Sako, some folks are not into that. But having said that, I do like to try to make, given that the werewolves exist, how can I make this seem a little bit more believable? I think that's one of the reasons that kind of gets downplayed about Stephen King, but it's one of the reasons why he's a worldwide best-selling author, is because he does such a good job of making these not real things feel real in the character's point of view. When Danny is seeing the ghosts and having his telepathic powers, those visions, like describing the corpse coming out of the bathtub in The Shining is, like understanding, doing your research as understanding what the stages of decay are for a body, so that you could describe the purple skin and the loose skin and the clammy hands grabbing his neck, which is a profound description. I remember since the time I read it when I was way too young to read it, but I digress. But the point is, so when I make my characters, when I make this werewolf story, like there is a prologue to Red December. I read the chapter 1. I didn't read the prologue, but the prologue takes place in Alaska, and they have these infected wolf corpses, and they hire, and it's from the point of view of this hired trucker, part-time trucker, who's kind of like a trucking temp, who's like kind of desperate for a gig, and he gets hired by this government organization to pick up a load of these infected wolf corpses. And so I try to really research both the environmental agencies and the wardens in Alaska, and what kind of uniforms and weapons these government agents would have. I researched what it was like to be in the truck cab. I looked at I know a little bit about decaying animals because I grew up in a hunting culture and have hung some deer and taken apart some deer and cut the meat off the bones of deer and taken out their hearts and so forth, and watched them in sheds over time. So like the idea is that, so even though I invented this infestation that ends up creating lycanthropes, I wanted it to feel real to the reader, through the point of view of this trucker, seeing strange things happen with these dead wolves, or supposedly dead wolves. So that's I think, doing your homework, combining writing from experience with writing from research, and probably a key, and I think this is one of the things that Stephen King's really good at, is imitating the language of the way people, the habits of language, the syntax, the way people talk, and also the dialogue in our minds, stream of consciousness, being able to imitate that realistically when somebody's witnessing an impossible situation like a ghost or a werewolf. That's the way I think good horror comes about.
As a wrestling fan, I absolutely understand, because I have to throw wrestling into everything. It's kind of like I literally have the shirt that says everything comes back to wrestling. And since everything comes back to wrestling, wrestling itself would not be a thing if you could not suspend disbelief. Like, you have to believe that some things just are. It's just like, you know what? Just trust us on this one. Just go along with it. And I feel like that's the importance for like all things in horror and fantasy, science fiction. We're talking about technologies that don't exist, or creatures that don't exist, or the idea that somebody who's 125 pounds can pick up a guy who's 400 pounds and beat him in a straight up one-on-one fight. Regardless of how you look at it, it's the same thing. At some point, it's just like, listen, sit down, enjoy the ride. Just put the seatbelt on and enjoy the ride. Just trust us when we tell you it's going to be all right. Just go along with it. I think that's important for anyone who tries to enjoy fiction of any genre in any medium, including wrestling.
Yeah. Well, we can scientifically prove wrestlers exist. Whether the little one can throw the big one, that's maybe suspension of disbelief, but it can be wicked fun if you know.
We had characters like Kane and the Undertaker. That's where we had the suspension of disbelief.
Nice. Yeah, I'm kind of easy with my suspension of disbelief. I'll roll with a lot of stuff, but it's kind of categorized. If I see something that's slapstick or kitschy, I'll be like, okay, this is slapstick and kitschy, and so I don't need to believe every little bit of it. It's satirical, it's cool. And then, so I don't worry too much about that. But I do love it when somebody can make something not real feel like it's real.
That's important. That's nice.
What first drew you to writing horror, and how has your style evolved since you started?
I think I was more of a fantasy kid. I was a Dungeons and Dragons player, but growing up in Bangor, Maine, the Stephen King stuff on the brain all the time because it's a small town and he was a big presence there. So I read his books at a really young age, like an almost inappropriately young age. I was sneaking those books off the shelves. But I drifted back into horror, because when I was younger, I got really into Dungeons and Dragons. Then as a teenager, I got into music, started playing in bands, and did just music and lyrics and poetry when I was college age. And I always liked horror, but it definitely wasn't my main thing back then. And I've started writing fantasy again, actually, but it's more like grim dark. So there are horror elements in it. But in the middle, I think I got fed up somewhere along the line when I was young with literary poetry and sort of uber serious folk music. Like I care about lyrics and I like all that stuff, but there was some point when I was kind of like considering going to grad school for poetry and considering being in different bands, where I just kind of got a little fed up with the poetry and the quote unquote literary canonical literary style of things, and said, like, I had actually gotten a scholarship to a conference called Stone Coast for poetry, which is in Bowdoin in Maine in the 90s. And I was the Stone Coast scholar for poetry, and I had to do a poetry reading, but I found myself sneaking over and hanging out with the genre fiction writers. And they were really fun to hang out with. And the genre fiction stuff was fun because it didn't seem so stuffy. Like, it was just like, we can have werewolves, we can have vampires, we can rip each other's heads off. It's awesome. Like, it just seems so irreverent, like, and that's why, like, I would hate to see it lose that irreverence, like I that's why I was like earlier with when the allegory is too obvious. I feel like we lose that irreverence, because part of what attracted me to horror was that I felt like, I could let my hair down, and just rock out, and didn't, like, so that was one of the things that brought me in.
How do you think the horror genre has changed over time, and what trends do you see emerging?
I feel like the obvious allegory style of horror is more is really prevalent these days, and then a lot of people, I guess, like that style, but it depends. Like, I wish I could think of that name of that movie that that was obviously forgettable, one of those Netflix flicks, but I think that something that does allegory well, Candyman is a good example. Antlers is another good example. I liked both those movies. Like, because they were doing some political allegory, but they did it well. And I feel like that seems to be what's at stake mostly now, is how are you how are you presenting your allegory? I think there's a demand now for stuff to be, well, the Joker's another good example. Like, I think it did a good job all the way through until the end, where I feel like they almost had to gloss it for everyone. This guy's going to do like a shooting on stage on a show because we're going to explain to you how media and violence and his illness are causing problems, like, and so I feel like that's kind of what's changed. I feel like in decades past, with the turn of the 21st century, the idea that, it has to be a cool story first, and we're not going to try to be expository about our symbols. That's changed. Now we're a little bit more comfortable with that and kind of asking for that. So I think that's what's changed in the horror genre. And then, of course, another thing that's changed a lot is the economy of writing, with the internet, small presses, ebooks, and all that, which is an entirely other conversation. My own path, where I had written horror novel in the aughts, and I had a professional agent at one point that was sending it to Leisure Books. I went to the horror writers. It wasn't called the Stoker Con at that time. I think it was just called World Horror Convention, and I was in the process of coming close to a more mainstream book deal, and but that was right about the time that I guess some of the mainstream publishers were dropping a lot of authors, and self-publishing was blooming on Amazon, and the internet was becoming this sort of like broker for everybody, and all the culture of reviews and comments, and the different groups forming around larger indie presses and smaller indie presses, and all the transformations. That's how it's changed. And so I ended up going with a small press, but I think there's a lot of the culture of how it's produced and consumed has changed a lot from the time when you just queried an agent, and if you had skill and some luck, you could get a book in a bookstore and then you'd make your money that way. Now it's a lot more like the music industry where you form a band, you write your songs, you release your CD, whereas now it's like you write your book, you can release it yourself. It's not as frowned upon, obviously, as it used to be. In fact, it's encouraged, and it's almost like people want to see you building your own following first before they bringing a, help invest in what you're doing to get your paperback widely distributed. So that's another change.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think you guys probably know a lot more about that than I do. I'm a little bit from the past here on that.
I mean, we know a little bit. I follow Sako's lead mostly.
Oh,
it is kind of the point of the show.
Right.
What are the most common misconceptions people have about the horror genre, and how do you challenge them in your own work?
The one I run into the most often is, "Whoa, what's wrong with you? You want to hurt people? Like you want to
No, that's why we write. Yeah.
We like to not hurt people.
Right, exactly. Oh my God, you have tattoos and you werewolves and they rip people apart. Like this one. So my first novella I did with 7th Star Press, Slash of Crimson, and I'll just spoiler it. That one kind of did better than the other two in the first release. It was almost more of an urban fantasy. It was about a heavy metal band, and it was about a guy living in Portland, Maine, playing in a small town metal band, playing at the local bars, and he rescues this girl who's drowning off the coast because he sea kayaks, right? So he's sea kayaking and he rescues this person who he thinks is drowning, and she tells him that she's a mermaid, but she turns out she's actually a demon who escaped from hell, from a crack in hell at the bottom of the ocean and came up, and she's being hunted by angels. And so she becomes this kind of Yoko Ono figure in the band. He starts dating her and she kind of takes over the band and kind of gets the band to help her fight these angels that are pursuing her. And so the angels that are pursuing her are led by their scions on Earth are these, is this Bible cult group in the town. And so this preacher with his minions is helping the angels hunt this demon. And so the demons become the good guys and the angels become the bad guys. And it's tragic. I won't spoil the very last bit of the ending, but basically I caught some flack from are you anti-religious? You're anti-church. You're how could the demons be the good guys? This is and Chains in the Sky, my second novel, is set in the same universe. They're hunting a demon in Brooklyn, but the angels are kind of evil, and heaven is a dystopia where they hold people prisoner. It's not fun to sit around in the clouds. They make you work. And it's the idea is that I've caught, so the idea is in horror, they're why would you write about these things? Why would you take these things that are good and make them bad? But to my mind, it's about, this is the way in which you explore deception in the way that the wolves in sheep's clothing that are around us all the time, pretending they're nice when they're not. And this is an important thing to do. And just because you're writing about these horrific things, it doesn't mean that you once again sympathize with the horrific actions being taken, but it means that you're writing about an emotional reality. So I try if people ask me directly, why would anybody like horror in that thing? I'm like, well, it's about survival. It's about analysis. It's about uncovering deceptions and cultural elements that could be deceiving. Usually they end up just shaking their heads and being like, oh yeah, but it's just so gross and it's so awful. It's hard to get through on that point. I know that the popular answer, I think, among horror writers is that horror is about survival. It's about how bad can something be, and we still have the spirit of survival, even no matter how awful it is. And this comes slasher films are always like that, with Last Girl motifs and those sorts of things. Everybody, you run, and then the guy with the chainsaw eventually gets you. So it's about survival in that way. But I also think for me, it's about, this is where we can go safely and explore the things that symbolically that we're not allowed to talk about, and the people who seem good can be exposed to not necessarily be so good, and you can write about it vividly and with images that are frightening and violent, but at the same time you can then finish the book and think about it, and everything's okay. Like waking up from a nightmare that was frightening while you were having it but gave you great insight.
Yeah.
Flawless answer.
It's all Sako.
What advice would you give to other writers about building suspense and maintaining tension throughout a story?
Well, I don't, I try not to be I try not to play the instructor very often because people I don't well, all right, since I've been quoting him all the way through this, we talk about Stephen King's On Writing. The way he put it was, what gives me the right to tell people how to write? I've sold a lot of books, but McDonald's has sold a lot of hamburgers, and you wouldn't go to them to learn how to be a chef, right? So you can go to a writing conference and you can have a professor, a creative writing instructor, or a professor who makes very little money from their books. There's a whole, this topic about, what advice would you give horror writers? What advice would you give poets? What advice would you give fantasy writers? There's a whole culture of discussion, it seems to me, from the professionals, say in the HWA, mid-list writers, people with paperbacks at Barnes and Noble, indie writers who sell. I have a friend in Maine. She sells a lot of books on Amazon. She makes a lot of money every month on Amazon, but she isn't necessarily recognized by some folks as a pro because she's self-published, and yet she's making more money than a lot of folks that are recognized as pros. So who gets to give the advice, and what advice do you give them? I would say, make sure that it comes through that you're loving what you're doing, but don't let that be an excuse not to care about the craft. So, the reason you want to be a horror writer is because you care about this genre and you love it passionately. You'll sit down and write all day the way somebody will sit down and play a video game all day, or play guitar all day, or play basketball all day, because you're passionate about it. But having said that, that doesn't mean you can just bang on the keys and tell yourself you're good. You gotta learn all of the techniques and the skills that create narrative and that interact with the human mind and heart in a way that creates drama and suspense, and all those techniques you got to learn about. I like to read. One of the nice things about the canonical literature, learning all the terms and so forth. Here's my advice, and you can, Aristotle's Poetics, you learn about peripeteia, you learn about hamartia, you learn about all the terms in tragedy and in drama, so that you can, write a script with all of the elements that grab people's attention. But you don't want to be too technical that way. You don't want to just come across as academic and lame and boring. So you keep that stuff. It's like learning theory in music. You sit there, you learn the modes, you play the scales all day. But then when you go to jam with the band or play your song, you're not thinking of those things. Those things are in you, and that will inform your music. And so you sit down, you write a song. You wrote a song about your favorite uncle who died, and the emotion is there. And you play that at the campfire, then you play it on the stage, then you record it. It's the same with the story. You let the story be organic. Stephen King wrote Carrie. It was a mix of a babysitter. He says this in our writing, but a mix of a babysitter and a student he had, a babysitter when he was a kid and a student. So you look for those visceral life experiences that are emotional. They're going to tug at somebody, writing what you know. But then you make sure that your technical skills are there to bolster that, to give it some framework. That's what I would say. That seems to be what most of the successful folks, in whichever way you define success, that seems to be what they would do, and that's what I would want to do.
Well, thank you for. I don't know. Does Moon have nothing?
No, I feel like that answer is the best way to wrap this up.
Yeah.
Well, let me say thank you to Sako and the Moon, Sako and Dwan. You guys are awesome. This was a super fun time. Speaking about being passionate about what you do, I could do this all day. The way you play a video game, man. You guys are so fun. Your vibe is so good, and I appreciate both of you so much. And we got a good thing going at the convention each year. That reading was super good last year, and this conversation was great. This is what gives it meaning. So all the thanks go to you guys.
You're very
absolutely. Thank you, man. Because like your reading was like, I remember reading about that scene in the little diner. I'm like, okay, this book is the truth right here. This is gonna be some good stuff right here. This is lined up. But it's fun to do those kinds of things, and this is what we're supposed to do when we're from small presses or indies. You know, we're supposed to. That's one of the point of our convention. We support each other, we love each other, and this is the way we show that. So we greatly appreciate you being here, man.
My pleasure. Rock on. Looking forward to doing more of this with you all. Thank you.
Right.
Oh yeah, so you'll definitely be back.
If you like this video at any point, we have this other video where Dirty Magic Magazine's owner Charlie Brown talks about the importance of setting. So check that out, and we'll see you next week when we interview horror author S.A. Bradley. Hit the notification bell so you don't miss it, but we'll catch you guys on the other side of the thing. Yes.
You know what to do.
You know what to do.